I am a woman of 31 years, and for this discussion, you may refer to me as Gina. My husband, Greg, is 33 years old. We have been married for a decade and have been together for nearly 13 years. We are parents to 2 children, a 9-year-old girl and an 8-year-old boy. Before my affair, Greg was the only man I had ever been involved with, whereas he had 3 previous girlfriends before we started dating. Our marriage was filled with love, laughter, and family joy. Despite being married for many years, our intimacy remained incredibly fulfilling for both of us. Now, here's where I made a huge mistake. I met a man, let's call him Rich, at my daughter's soccer practice. He was the father of a 6-year-old girl who played in the league below my daughter's. Rich worked from home, allowing him to attend soccer practices and games. Initially, I spoke to him as part of a group of parents while we watched our children on the sidelines. The reason he stood out was that he was one of the few dads present during practices, which typically happened right after school. Over time, we began talking more frequently, and I noticed that he would always come over and stand near me at every practice, even when I was with other moms. These conversations eventually led to an uncomfortable discussion where he confessed he had strong feelings for me. I made it clear that I was happily married and that we needed to stop talking. He respected my decision and backed off. Strangely, even though I had rejected his advance, I found myself enjoying the attention. I know it was terribly wrong, but I want to be honest about what I was feeling. Eventually, he brought up his feelings again and asked if I would meet him for coffee at a cafe in a neighboring town. Initially, I refused, but later I decided to meet him, with the understanding that it would be a one-time coffee meeting and nothing more. Looking back, I realized that just talking to him was a form of cheating and a complete disrespect to my husband and family, but I couldn't seem to stop myself. At the end of our private meeting, just before we left for our children's practice, he suggested that I come to his house the following day at the same time. He handed me a piece of paper with his home address. I initially declined, but he gently kissed me, and I am ashamed to admit that not only did I kiss him back, but I kissed him again when he pulled away. The next day, we met at his house and engaged in an affair. There was no conversation or build-up, we just went ahead with it. As I looked around and saw photos of his beautiful wife and child, I became deeply upset with myself. Thoughts of Greg and my kids overwhelmed me, and I burst into tears, telling Rich that I couldn't continue this. We cleaned up, got dressed, and left in our separate cars for our children's practice. During the following week, I made an effort to avoid Rich at soccer practice. When I finally did speak to him again, I firmly told him that I wanted no further contact with him. In response, he handed me a note containing the name and address of a hotel in the same neighboring town. He mentioned that he wanted me to meet him there the next day at our usual time but understood if I chose not to. I simply said, "No, I can't," and left. That night, I stayed awake, wrestling with the realization that this situation could destroy my marriage and family if it ever became known. Yet, I foolishly believed the risk was minimal since we never used calls or texts, all our interactions were verbal or through handwritten notes. I had no plans to go, but I eventually succumbed and met him. Like our initial encounter, it ended with me in tears, telling Rich that we couldn't continue this. He agreed this time, but he felt our intimate moments were worth the risk. We separated and stayed apart for an entire month, with no contact except for brief conversations during soccer practice and games when talking to other parents. What troubled me most was that during one of the games, my husband Greg and Rich ended up chatting for over 20 minutes. It made me feel terrible, but in a twisted way, it also excited me for some reason. Fast forward to my D-Day, the day my husband discovered my affair, the absolute worst day of my life. Already crying, Rich and I had talked at soccer practice the day before and agreed that we shouldn't meet anymore. We were both happily married and loved our spouses and children. However, here's where I made a truly terrible mistake. We decided to meet one final time. I know some people here might find it hard to believe, but it's the truth. D-Day was supposed to be our last meeting. I didn't want to meet at Rich's house because I couldn't bear to see the photos of his wife and child, so I suggested that he come to my home instead. The plan was for him to park on a nearby street, walk over to my house, and enter through the side door where I would let him in. Since it was lightly raining and there was no one on the street, I thought he did so without anyone noticing. I took him to our home office on the second floor, which has a guest bed, and that's where we met. I want to emphasize that I would never have done anything in our marital bed as we did at Rich's house because I have too much love and respect for my husband. Since this was going to be our final encounter, there was a lot of kissing and foreplay before the actual intimate act. I'm not sure what came over Rich, but he suddenly panicked and attempted to rush past Greg, who was blocking the door. Greg is quite tall, standing at over 6 feet and weighing nearly 230 pounds, whereas Rich is around 5 feet 10 inches and weighs only about 160 pounds. As a result, Rich bounced off Greg and fell backward to the floor. Undeterred, he got back up and tried to charge at Greg again, but this time Greg took a step forward and forcefully pushed him back. The force of the push sent Rich flying backward, causing him to collide with one of the window screens and fall out of the window, landing on a large bush in front of our house. It was shocking because he was completely unclothed. I was in tears and pleaded with Greg to stop, fearing that he would harm Rich, and I didn't want Greg to face legal trouble. In response, Greg gave me a hostile look and hastily went downstairs. I was concerned he might physically harm Rich and was anxious about my husband's legal situation. I watched from the window in a blanket and saw Rich still lying unclothed in the bush, trying to free himself. I could see that he had scratches and was bleeding, although it didn't seem to be a serious injury. Greg emerged from the house holding Rich's cell phone and began shouting at Rich, demanding his passcode. Rich began begging for mercy, pleading with Greg not to hurt him and not to call his wife, Kate. Greg became angry and threatened Rich, saying, "Give me the damn code, or there will be consequences." In response, Rich quickly provided the code, and Greg entered it into the phone. Greg then made a call to Kate, introducing himself and explaining the situation. He told her he was standing there with her husband, whom he had just caught in an intimate act with his wife. After some more discussion and reassurance, he provided Kate with our address and ended the call. I noticed our next-door neighbor approaching us. He inquired if everything was all right. Greg replied that it wasn't, but he would handle it. He expressed gratitude for the neighbor's alertness and explained that he had caught us in the act. The neighbor mentioned that he suspected something was wrong when he saw a man loitering outside our house. Initially, he thought it might be a burglary until he saw me opening the door and letting the man in. Feeling uneasy, the neighbor decided to call Greg. Greg informed the neighbor that he planned to contact the police to report the incident. Hearing this, Rich started crying and begged Greg not to involve the authorities. At that moment, Rich was still unclothed and visibly trembling. I called down to Greg, pleading with him not to call the police, but he ignored my pleas and proceeded with the call. The police arrived within a few minutes. Greg and our neighbor met the officer at the curb, engaging in a discussion for several minutes, gesturing toward the neighbor's house and then up to our office window. They then walked over to the bush where Rich was huddled, crying and still unclothed. The officer asked Greg if he could retrieve Rich's clothes, and Greg agreed. When I heard Greg open the door, I rushed to the top of the stairs, crying and expressing how sorry I was and how much I loved him. However, he didn't look up. He simply gathered Rich's clothes and shoes from the floor and stairs and returned outside. The officer took the clothing from Greg and handed them to Rich, who clumsily got dressed. Rich was hyperventilating and still shaking intensely. At this point, I had never seen someone in such a state and realized it was likely due to a mix of nervous fear, shock, and the cold, as it was around 55 degrees outside. I stood by the window while the officer questioned Rich, but they couldn't see me due to the window screens we have. The officer instructed Rich to calm down and relax, which he eventually managed to do. Rich took responsibility for what happened, admitting it was entirely his fault. He gave an honest account of the situation, explaining that he charged at Greg because he just wanted to escape. The officer asked whether Greg's action of pushing him was defensive or offensive, to which Rich responded that it was defensive. I felt relieved that Rich didn't falsely accuse Greg. Before long, a group of neighbors had gathered in front of our house. The neighbor who had alerted Greg was explaining the situation to them. I was deeply embarrassed and couldn't help but cry even harder. Returning to the police officer and Rich, the officer inquired if Rich wanted to press charges, but Rich declined. He expressed his desire to leave and promised never to disturb our family again. Shortly after, Rich's wife, Kate, arrived in front of our house. My husband went out to meet her, and they had a brief conversation. Rich rushed over to her, crying and apologizing, but she didn't acknowledge him. The officer spoke to Kate, and I could faintly hear her saying that she wanted Rich to stay away from her. The officer then instructed Rich to step back, which he did, and he started sobbing uncontrollably. The officer had a conversation with Greg and Kate for a few minutes before entering the house to talk to me. He called up the stairs and asked if I could come down and have a conversation with him. I agreed but requested a minute to get dressed. The officer then took my statement, and towards the end of our conversation, he mentioned that my husband had requested that I voluntarily leave the home. I told the officer that I didn't want to leave and that I needed to discuss this with my husband. The officer understood my feelings but explained that it might be best if I left at least for the night to allow things to settle down. I broke into tears, and the officer asked if there was someone I could call. I told him yes, my parents. Almost immediately, I heard my mom on the porch talking to Greg. When I saw her expression, I simply said, "Mom, I'm sorry. I messed up really badly." The officer then explained to my mom that it would be advisable for me to stay with her for a few days until things calmed down. I went upstairs with my mom to pack my belongings. She didn't say anything while I was packing, but it was clear she was upset, embarrassed, and deeply disappointed in me. Once my mom and I returned downstairs and stepped outside, only the officer was there along with several neighbors who were still on the sidewalk talking. The officer informed us that Greg had left to pick up the kids from school and would take them to practice followed by dinner. He mentioned that Greg had asked that I close and lock the door and that Greg would get in touch with me in a few days to talk. When we got back to my parents' house, both my mom and dad reprimanded me for ruining my marriage. I simply apologized and expressed my determination to regain Greg's trust. My dad, however, told me that it was unlikely to happen and that I should start preparing for a divorce. This news brought me to tears, and my mom asked him why he would say such a thing. He responded bluntly, "Because it's true." Over the next 2 days, I sent texts and called Greg repeatedly, but he didn't respond. Then on Wednesday evening, he sent a text suggesting that we meet on Saturday morning at our house to discuss our next steps. In that same text, he mentioned that he had already talked to our kids about what happened, and I couldn't believe he had done this without me. I feared that our kids might now despise me. In another text message, Greg informed me that he had pressed charges against Rich and obtained a 30-day restraining order, TRO. I disliked hearing this news because I just wanted this nightmare to be over. To make matters worse, the incident had been reported in the police section of our local newspaper. Although it didn't mention names or our house number, it did reveal our street name and made it clear what had occurred. Saturday arrived, and I felt a mix of excitement and nervousness about seeing Greg again. My dad and mom drove me to our house and stayed on the porch as Greg and I met inside. I told them they could leave, but Greg insisted on them staying as he didn't trust being alone with me. When I approached him for a hug, he held up his hands to keep me at a distance. We sat down, and he handed me separation papers. I broke down in tears and pleaded with him, saying, "No, please don't do this." I continued to beg and express how deeply sorry I was and that I loved him, only him. However, he responded with a firm no, and began explaining the contents of the separation papers. Despite my continued pleas, he kept on explaining the details of how the separation would work. He mentioned that I could move back into the house, but I would be staying in the office, which would remain as it was when I left. He then talked about splitting our bank accounts evenly and dividing the equity in the house in case it was ever sold. However, he emphasized that he wanted me to waive any claim to his 401k retirement account. He went on to explain that starting the following month, would be responsible for contributing 35% of our living expenses. These expenses included the mortgage, insurance, utilities, car payments, groceries, and so on. Given that I didn't have a job, I would need to pay him this amount from my share of the savings. He made it clear that all of these terms were spelled out in the separation agreement and advised me to consult with a lawyer to review it. I expressed my reluctance to involve a lawyer and reiterated my desire to talk to him about our relationship. But he calmly, yet firmly, stated that there was nothing left to discuss and that he just wanted to officially separate from me. He also clarified that he would only communicate with me regarding matters related to our children or when our children were present during the conversation. Everything else I said was ignored. With tears streaming down my face, I asked if he intended to divorce me. He responded, "At this moment, that's my plan." I told him I couldn't fathom living without him and that I was willing to fight with all my strength to save our relationship. He just looked at me with disdain and burst into loud laughter. He then called my parents into the room and placed his parents on speakerphone, sharing everything he had just told me with both sets of parents. It felt like a business meeting, but for me, it was sheer agony. All I could do was apologize to Greg. This all happened earlier today, and now I find myself here in the office, writing this post at 1:44 a.m. because I can't sleep. When I talked to my sister earlier, she gave me some valuable advice and suggested I post here to see if any readers might offer additional suggestions that could be helpful. So here I am, seeking guidance. What should I do? Have I irreparably damaged my marriage? Is there any hope of reclaiming the beautiful life I destroyed, or is it lost forever? I welcome all responses, even the critical ones. Right now, I feel like an outcast with no one to turn to. My sister has been supportive, although she too is disappointed in my actions. Thank you in advance for taking the time to read this and for any replies you may offer. Gina. A lot has happened in my life since my last update. Firstly, I want to express my gratitude to everyone who responded to my original post. Reading all the responses provided me with some solace, even though many of them were highly critical of my behavior. From my own experience, I can attest that not every story has a happy ending. In fact, some endings are truly heartbreaking. Greg and I are now officially divorced, and just typing those words brings tears to my eyes. I still can't fully grasp the reality of it all. It feels like a never-ending nightmare. If you recall from my initial post, my husband and I were living together in our home despite being legally separated. In the beginning, things were distant and cold between us, but over the first month, Greg gradually started warming up. He began talking to me more, even sharing laughter and jokes with me and the kids. I felt hopeful about our progress and believed that if we continued on this path, we could reconcile. Then, unexpectedly, 4 months into our separation, Greg expressed the desire to have a private conversation with me without the kids. I thought it might be a discussion about taking the next steps toward reconciliation, but to my shock, he told me he wanted a divorce. I was utterly devastated. I know the term devastated is used frequently in these posts, but I can assure you that I truly felt that way. Greg clarified that while he would always care deeply for me as the mother of our 2 beautiful children, the love, passion, and trust he once had for me had disappeared. I did everything I could to change his mind, but his decision was final. We hugged, but it didn't feel like the embrace of a husband and wife, it was more like 2 friends. Since we had been separated for nearly 4 months and had already agreed on the division of assets and custody in our separation agreement, the divorce process proceeded swiftly and was finalized in February of this year. Greg treated me fairly. He bought out my equity share in our home and even gave me an additional $10,000 to ensure I could provide a stable home for our kids. Despite having a decent sum of money from the divorce, it wasn't enough to buy a home or sustain me for the rest of my life. So, I ended up taking a job at a new donut franchise conveniently located down the street from our kids' school. I knew the woman who owned the franchise, so I reached out to her about a job, and she hired me on the spot. Despite what you might assume, I genuinely enjoy working there. The owner is incredibly kind and understanding, my colleagues are fantastic, and our customers are extremely friendly. Sometimes, I wish I had taken this job while I was married. Perhaps things wouldn't have turned out the way they did. You know the saying, an idle mind is the devil's playground, or something like that. I can't reverse time, but contrary to what you might assume, I absolutely love my job. The owner is incredibly kind and understanding, my co-workers are wonderful, and our customers are exceptionally friendly. Sometimes, I wish I had started working while I was still married, maybe things would have turned out differently. There's an old saying, an idle mind is the devil's playground, or something like that. Anyway, what's done is done, and I can't change the past. It's quite evident that Greg and Kate began their relationship during our separation. Rumor has it they started seeing each other shortly after D-Day, but since we live in a no-fault state, it doesn't make a difference legally. Unlike Greg and me, Kate wasted no time in divorcing Rich. Their divorce was finalized months before ours, mainly because their house was a gift to her, and they didn't have much in savings to complicate the process. Rich's situation is particularly tragic. He took the divorce very hard, and on Halloween last year, he was arrested for a DUI, his second offense. Kate used this against him to gain full custody of their daughter. Now, Rich only has supervised visitation, which takes place at Kate's parents' house because Greg and Kate don't want to see him, and Rich is afraid of Greg. Reflecting on my own circumstances, I see how drastically my life has shifted. My parents have been supportive, despite their disappointment. I've accepted my new reality, but it's a difficult path. The job at the donut shop has surprisingly been a source of comfort and stability for me. Each day at work, I find solace in the friendly interactions with customers and the camaraderie with my coworkers. It's a stark contrast to the chaos in my personal life. Sometimes, I wonder how things might have been different if I had found this job sooner. Maybe staying occupied could have prevented some of my poor decisions. Meanwhile, Greg and Kate's relationship seems to be thriving. They are frequently seen together, and it appears they've moved on from their past relationships. It's painful to observe, but I'm trying to focus on rebuilding my own life. My children are my main priority, and I aim to provide them with the best environment possible under the circumstances. The legal proceedings involving Rich and Kate serve as a stark reminder of how messy and complicated relationships can become. Rich's downward spiral is heartbreaking, especially considering how it impacts their daughter. Supervised visitation at Kate's parents' house is a tough situation for everyone involved. Overall, the past year has been an emotional roller coaster filled with challenges. I've learned a great deal about myself and the importance of owning up to my actions. Moving forward, I hope to create a more stable and positive life for myself and my children. The support from my family and the unexpected joy from my job give me hope that better days are ahead. I learned about all this through the grapevine. It seems unfair and harsh for Kate to take such drastic actions against her child's father, even if she harbors strong negative feelings towards him. However, I do understand her reasons. Kate and her daughter are currently living with Greg and my children in what used to be my home. Even though it's no longer technically mine, I still think of it that way. This entire situation is incredibly disheartening. I try my best not to dwell on it, though it's constantly on my mind. I attempt to reassure myself that what's happening with Kate is just a temporary phase for Greg, much like the phase I went through with Rich. Kate is young and attractive, she's only 26, making her a new distraction for Greg given the stressful circumstances that brought them together. I doubt their love is genuine. Nonetheless, I still hold on to the hope that Greg and I will eventually reunite. In the meantime, I genuinely wish him and Kate all the best. Recently, I received news that my contact with Greg will be further limited. He informed me that starting this Wednesday, we will only communicate about our kids via email. Greg mentioned that Kate has been communicating with Rich in the same manner, and he wants to do the same. Hearing this was another blow for me. I believe Kate must have influenced this decision, as Greg wouldn't cut me off like this on his own. As for myself, I've been dedicating most of my time to decorating my new apartment and making it a comfortable space for my kids. It only has 2 bedrooms, so things are a bit tight, but we're managing. I wish I could go back and change the past, but that's not possible, so I'm focused on moving forward one small step at a time. This is where I currently stand. Thanks for taking the time to read this. Alright, that was a tough story, but let's move on to another one. I met my wife when I was 16 years old, and we tied the knot when we were both 21. We welcomed our daughter at 22, and now we're both 47. The day I discovered her infidelity was rather unusual. I woke up feeling unwell and nearly considered calling in sick to work. Instead, I decided to go in but ended up leaving early. In hindsight, I'm grateful I left work early that day. My wife also had a job, and I wonder if it was something I ate or some random illness that made me feel this way. By the way, she was an excellent cook, probably the only thing she excelled at. Now that I think about it, one significant warning sign I completely overlooked was her best friend Kay, who was single and frequently changed partners. She would share her escapades with my wife, and yet my wife would assert that she could never live that kind of lifestyle, expressing her happiness in marriage and family life. Ironically, Kay had even been involved with my wife's college boyfriend, yet she was my wife's closest friend. The company you keep says a lot about you. It wasn't until I discovered her cheating that I truly understood who my wife was. So that morning, feeling unwell, I headed to work. After having some coffee, I felt a bit better, but the waves of nausea persisted. I clocked out at lunchtime and, before heading home, I stopped to get some medication, hoping it would help me sleep off the ailment. My wife was supposed to be at work as well. She had prepared for her workday that morning, and I typically left for work before her. As I pulled into our building, I noticed my wife's car parked there, along with another car in the neighbor's spot. I thought maybe he had a visitor but then wondered why his car was missing and why my wife's car was there. Finding no parking space, I decided to pull out and park on the street in front of our building. As I approached the door, I heard incredibly loud music blasting. Initially, I thought it might be the neighbors, but I soon realized it was coming from our unit. From the front of the unit, I could see our bedroom window, and the music was definitely coming from there. Upon entering, my suspicions were confirmed. Music was playing inside our place. Hastily, I climbed the stairs, opened the bedroom door, and there it was. My wife was engaging in physical activity with a guy who I later discovered was her boss. Her best friend was also there, hugging the man. Over the music, I shouted, "What the hell?" My wife swiftly dismounted the guy and implored me to calm down, addressing me as honey. Enraged, I shoved my wife aside and proceeded to physically confront the guy. Her best friend joined in the altercation, landing a solid punch to my nose. Although it wasn't broken, I needed medical attention to set it straight. Attempting to sue her and her boss for their involvement with my wife is another complicated story, far from the simplicity of internet advice. My wife and her best friend started brawling amongst themselves, creating an utterly chaotic scene. When I look back on it now, it seems surreal and unbelievable. The realization of her betrayal, combined with the physical altercation, left me in shock. It's a memory that still haunts me, but I've learned to move forward. I still can't wrap my head around the absurdity of the situation. I turned off the music and demanded the man leave my house immediately. He obeyed quickly, even fleeing while still partially unclothed. When I went to another room to look out the window, I saw he had managed to put on his pants and was rushing to his car downstairs. Returning to the room where my wife and her friend were arguing, her friend encouraged my wife to confess and tell me everything. My wife stayed silent, staring at her friend. Eventually, her friend admitted that this was their lifestyle, and my wife had joined her in this business 3 years ago when I lost my job. I was laid off while my wife kept her job. During that time, I was receiving unemployment benefits, but losing such a large part of our income made things very difficult for us. Her friend mentioned that my wife asked her for financial help, and she suggested my wife join her in her line of work. I asked what kind of work this was, but she implied I already knew. I insisted that I didn't and had never really paid attention, only noticing that she was often with different men whenever I saw her. She explained that men paid her for her services, primarily for dates and conversations. I interrupted, asking, "So you're a sex worker?" She just stared at me. I turned to look at my wife, but she kept her head down. After that, I left the house and drove to a nearby family member's home, where I shared everything: divorce plans, STD/STI testing, and paternity testing. Divorcing my wife seemed the only option. With the help of a close family member, I found a divorce attorney who covered the initial costs, though I later repaid him despite his assurance that I didn't need to worry about it. After a checkup with my doctor, I got a clean bill of health, and the paternity test confirmed my beautiful daughter was indeed mine. I tried to file a lawsuit for alienation of affection, something I hadn't heard of until my lawyer brought it up. Her boss denied the claims, arguing he wasn't responsible for our marital issues. My wife supported his stance, saying our marriage had been falling apart long before her affair with him. To make a long story short, the lawsuit was dismissed. Given our financial limitations and my main focus on the divorce, that became my top priority. As a result, both my ex-wife and her boss were fired from their jobs. I suspect my ex-wife may have continued working as a sex worker, but it's unlikely anyone would want her services now. It appears she might want to reconcile with me. Our daughter's wedding isn't the first time she has expressed her longing for me. On another occasion, we were all together, making plans with my daughter, when my ex-wife suddenly said, "Oh my gosh, I remember our honeymoon. We stayed at a hotel near a concert, and it was so much fun." I deliberately ignored her remark, hoping to avoid that topic, but she continued, saying, "We used to be so happy, but I had to go and ruin everything." I kept disregarding her, but soon tears filled her eyes. My daughter noticed her mother's distress and asked what was bothering her. My ex-wife admitted that she had ruined her own life and felt utterly alone. She expressed how she was trying to communicate but felt ignored. She begged my daughter to promise that she would do everything possible to keep her own family together and avoid making the same mistakes she had made. I struggled to hold back my laughter but couldn't suppress it entirely, causing both my daughter and ex-wife to look at me. I quickly excused myself to the restroom, where I burst into laughter. I couldn't believe the absurdity of the situation. I even made fun of myself in the mirror before composing myself and returning to the main room. We then continued with our planning. On the day of my daughter's wedding, my ex-wife approached me, saying she missed me. She mentioned that being at our daughter's wedding reminded her of the love we once shared and the family we used to have. She expressed deep regret over her actions that led to our family's downfall. She hoped that one day I might find it in my heart to forgive her. She tried to cry on my shoulder, but I gently pushed her away, telling her not to ruin my suit. I returned to the celebration of my daughter's special day. My daughter wanted both of us to take pictures together, so I did it for her sake. Honestly, I can't stand being around my ex-wife, but she always manages to find her way to me. I tried mingling with others and ensuring everyone was fine, but when I turned around, she was right behind me. I politely asked her, "Can you please step away?" She held onto my shoulder and pleaded, "Please listen to me, please." My daughter's cousins were watching us, clearly embarrassed by their aunt, just like I was. Eventually, we went back outside. I shouted at her, "What do you need?" She explained that she needed surgery for an issue with her reproductive system, some kind of cyst, and reassured me she would be fine. She said she felt alone and asked if I could take care of her during the week she would be recovering at home since our daughter would be abroad that month. I sympathized with her situation and wished her well, but I firmly stated that I couldn't take care of her. She began crying again and clung to me, but I gently pulled away. She asked, "So you won't be there for someone you used to love, the mother of your child?" I replied, "No." Then I asked about her best friend Kay, and she informed me that Kay was in a psychiatric hospital due to pill problems that had damaged her brain. Kay was facing many issues and had even attempted to harm a family member who tried to help her. I responded with a simple, "Oh," and turned to go back inside. Right after that, my ex-wife left. I saw her talking to our daughter before leaving, wiping tears from her face. But that wasn't the end of it. She managed to convince our daughter that I was a terrible person for not helping her during her surgery week. Our daughter got angry and upset, thinking she might have to cancel her trip and lose the money she had already spent on it. This situation added even more stress to an already emotionally charged day. Despite everything, I tried to focus on making my daughter's wedding day as special as possible, even though the presence of my ex-wife made it challenging. I have no plans to take care of that woman ever again. She should arrange for professional nursing assistance or something similar. It's not my duty. I am not at all surprised by my ex-wife's friend Kay and her problems with pills. I remember telling my ex-wife that I suspected Kay was using something, and I meant it. Kay always had this hyper demeanor and sometimes seemed jittery, but my ex-wife insisted it was just her usual behavior. Now, I think Kay probably had a history of using pills and might have accidentally taken something laced with harmful substances. When my daughter called me, she was in tears, saying I was being too harsh on her mother. She understood what her mom had done to me but felt I should still be there for her because it was the right thing to do. I told her that it wasn't going to happen and that I wouldn't be taking care of her mom. She has other family members who should take care of her, and it's not my responsibility. I made it clear that I wanted nothing to do with her mom. I tried to explain this to my daughter, but she just couldn't seem to understand. Despite this, my daughter didn't cancel her trip, she went ahead with it. My ex-wife made one final attempt to get me to help her, and it came with tears. I received a call from her sister's phone and briefly spoke to her sister. She said, "I'm calling on behalf of my sister, your ex-wife. She wants to talk to you." I declined and explained that I knew what this was about and didn't want to hear it. Her sister continued, saying that no one else was available to help and the surgery needed to be done urgently. She even offered to pay me to do it, but I firmly refused, saying there wasn't enough money in the world to make me help. I asked her to stop calling me. My ex-wife then got on the phone and asked me to stop being so stubborn and do what I was supposed to do. I pulled the phone away from my face and just stared at it, thinking, what am I supposed to do? I thought to myself, is she joking? I brought the phone back to my ear and asked her what she meant. She replied, "Yes, we're divorced, but we were once married, and we used to be in love. Love doesn't just vanish. How can I still have so much love for you, but you don't feel the same for me? You love our daughter, but you don't love me. It doesn't make sense." In response, I wished her luck with her surgery and then hung up. Afterward, I blocked her sister's number. I went ahead and blocked every one of her family members on my phone because I didn't want people texting or calling me, pleading with me to come take care of her. She's not my responsibility. If she hadn't betrayed me and had still been my wife, I'd have done anything for her. But considering the way she wronged me, possibly jeopardized my health, and tore my family apart, you're telling me I should help her? It's my duty as an ex-husband? Is that really a thing? Honestly, if any ex-husband is going out of their way to assist their ex-wife who hurt them, something seems seriously wrong, and they should seek help. It doesn't make sense to me, just like her best friend Kay, who ended up in a psychiatric hospital due to similar issues. I haven't heard from my ex-wife and have no idea how her surgery went. Truthfully, I don't wish harm upon her, and I hope her surgery went smoothly. I'm not that kind of person, but I won't be persuaded to come care for her, help her get back on her feet, only to be mistreated again.
Don't forget to subscribe, like, and click on the little bell icon for notifications of new stories.